Muslims never bowed to Poland because Poland never opened the door. While Germany welcomed over 1 million migrants in 2015 alone, Poland accepted fewer than 3,000 relocated refugees under EU quotas. Warsaw treated the border like a locked house, not a hotel with an open lobby. Brussels threatened fines. Poland didn't blink. So the question is, why didn't the pressure work? Every serious voice in Brussels after 2015 assumed migration was a wave nobody could hold back, a demographic tide that would eventually reach every shore, Poland included. Analysts pointed to Poland's shrinking workforce and aging population and said the math would force the country's hand the same way it had forced Germany's. Poland was expected to become the next Germany. It didn't. The number that broke the theory was almost embarrassingly small. Poland's Muslim population sat under 0.1%, somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people, and most of those weren't new arrivals at all. They were Tatar communities that had lived in Poland for centuries, quietly unremarkable, fully Polish. Those Tatars trace back to the 14th century, when Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania settled Muslim cavalrymen in villages like Bohoniki and Kruzyniany, both still home to wooden mosques standing today, one dated to roughly 1717. The 2011 Polish census recorded about 5,123 people identifying specifically as Tatar, alongside a separate, larger, harder-to-count population of post-1990s economic migrants and students from countries like Chechnya and Syria who arrived through ordinary visa channels rather than resettlement schemes. Compare that to France, where Muslims made up 8 to 10% of the population by the mid-2010s, or Germany, which crossed 5% after the 2015-16 arrivals. Poland wasn't resisting an Islamization wave. There was no wave to resist. That absence of scale is the first crack in the story everyone assumed was coming. The house Poland kept locked was never actually being knocked on, but the political fight over the lock happened anyway, and it happened loudly, starting with a number written into an EU spreadsheet in September 2015. Brussels assigned Poland roughly 6,200 refugees under the mandatory relocation scheme, a modest figure by any European standard, part of a broader plan to redistribute 160,000 asylum seekers from Italy and Greece across the bloc. Poland let in somewhere between 100 and 2,000 before shutting the process down entirely, with some counts putting the real figure closer to just 100 people processed under the scheme before Warsaw froze it in 2016. The European Commission didn't let it go quietly. In 2017, it referred Poland, along with Hungary and the Czech Republic, to the EU Court of Justice, with Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans publicly accusing the three states of solidarity failures. Warsaw had turned a bureaucratic quota into a constitutional standoff. That standoff needed a government willing to make it permanent, and Poland delivered one a month later. Law and Justice, known as PASES, won a parliamentary majority in October 2015 with about 37.6% of the vote, giving it 235 of 460 seats in the Sejm, campaigning explicitly on the idea that migration quotas were an attack on Polish sovereignty and Catholic identity. Party leader Jarosław Kaczynski gave the moment its ugliest, most memorable soundbite in October 2015, warning that migrants might bring in his words, parasites and protozoa, a claim medical experts publicly dismissed as baseless within days. It was a grotesque line. It also set the tone for the next decade. The tone held even when the pressure came from a different direction and a different neighbor. In 2021, Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko began funneling thousands of migrants, mostly from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, straight toward the Polish border, weaponizing them as leverage against the EU after sanctions were imposed over his contested 2020 re-election. By November 2021, an estimated 4,000 people were massed at the Kuznica crossing alone in freezing conditions, and at least a dozen migrants died along the frontier that winter, according to Polish and international aid groups. Poland's answer wasn't negotiation. It was concrete and steel. A 186-kilometer wall costing roughly 1.6 billion zloty, completed in June 2022, running 5.5 meters high and fitted with motion sensors and thermal cameras. In September 2021, Poland declared a state of emergency along the frontier, restricting journalists and NGOs from the area entirely, a restriction that lasted until July 2022. The house stayed locked, and now it had a wall around it too. Poland pointed constantly at what was happening on the other side of that wall as proof it had made the right call. Germany's 2015-16 intake exceeded 1 million asylum applicants, a number no other EU state came close to matching. By comparison, France received roughly 80,000 asylum applications in 2015, and Poland's own figure barely cleared 12,000, most from Ukraine and Russia, not Syria. Then came Cologne. The New Year's Eve assaults on December 31st, 2015, involving suspects with migrant backgrounds, an incident that saw over 1,200 criminal complaints filed, including roughly 500 alleging sexual assault, detonating across European media and hardening opinion far beyond Germany's borders. Sweden and France spent the rest of the decade locked in arguments about parallel societies and so-called no-go zones, with French officials in 2015 listing 751 so-called sensitive urban zones nationwide. Whether or not those debates were fully honest, Poland used them as a mirror held up to its own choice. Eventually, the argument stopped being political and became legal, and that's where the story hits its real turning point. In April 2020, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic had broken EU law by refusing the 2015 relocation quotas, a judgment delivered by the Grand Chamber under Case C-715/17. It was a clear, formal defeat on paper. But the original scheme had already expired in September 2017, so there was no binding enforcement left to apply, and no fine was ever actually levied over the refusal itself. PiS rejected the ruling's moral authority in public while quietly never actually complying with anything. Poland lost the case and still kept the lock on the door. Then Poland ran into the one contradiction it couldn't wall off. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and within months, Poland had taken in more than 1.5 million refugees. By mid-2022, Polish border guard data logged over 1.2 million border crossings from Ukraine in the first 2 weeks alone, and by 2023, more than 950,000 Ukrainians held temporary protection status inside Poland, according to UNHCR figures. No wall, no quota fight, no state of emergency. Instead, ordinary Polish families opened spare rooms, and the government passed a special law within days granting Ukrainians PESEL identification numbers, healthcare access, and the right to work. Those arrivals were overwhelmingly Christian, Slavic, and culturally familiar. Critics didn't miss the pattern. If Poland's border policy was really about security, why did the same government process over 1 million people almost overnight while spending years refusing a few thousand others? The lock, it turned out, opened for some people faster than others. That contradiction forces an uncomfortable audit of what Poland actually avoided. Poland's foreign-born population stayed under 3% through the early 2020s, compared to more than 15% in Germany, France, and Sweden, according to Eurostat estimates from around 2021. There was no pre-existing Muslim-majority migrant community in Poland to expand upon, no decades-old neighborhoods facing the integration strain Western Europe was still working through, unlike France's banlieues, many built in the 1960s and 70s to house post-colonial labor migrants from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Poland's starting line was nowhere near the same race. That gap in starting position is the quiet, unglamorous truth behind the whole story. Analysts note that Poland's low pre-2015 baseline made refusal cheap, politically speaking. There was no existing population to alienate, no established community demanding representation, no domestic political cost for saying no. Germany, by contrast, had been recruiting Turkish guest workers under bilateral agreements since 1961, meaning its Muslim population had 50-plus years of institutional roots by the time 2015 arrived. Germany and France couldn't unwind decades of migration even if they wanted to. Poland was simply never handed the bill in the first place. Not facing a crisis and solving one are two different achievements, and Poland's politics leaned hard into pretending they were the same thing. PiS held power from 2015 to 2023, building an entire governing identity around sovereignty and tradition, and won a second term in October 2019 with 43.6% of the vote, an even larger mandate than its first. The Polish Catholic Church, to which roughly 85% of Poles still nominally belonged in the 2010s, backed the restrictive line publicly and repeatedly through the late 2010s, with bishops issuing statements framing migration policy as a defense of national and religious identity, giving the policy a moral vocabulary beyond just border logistics. By the 2020 and 2023 elections, migration and EU authority were still the two questions every candidate had to answer. That fixture didn't dissolve when the government finally changed. Donald Tusk's pro-EU coalition took power in December 2023 after the October elections, promising a different tone toward Brussels. But the steel wall along the Belarus border stayed exactly where it was, fully operational, and Tusk's government even approved further reinforcements and a temporary buffer zone in 2024 amid renewed crossing attempts. Tensions between Warsaw and the EU over rule of law and migration policy carried straight on into 2023 and 2024 negotiations. Unresolved, just quieter, even as Brussels unfroze billions in previously withheld EU recovery funds tied to judicial reforms. The lock didn't rust, it just changed hands. Poland chose THE-LOCK, not THE-KEY. Europe built an open lobby and spent a decade arguing about who checks in and who checks out. Poland kept its house locked, chain on the latch, and never had to have that argument in the same way. Whether that was principle or just good timing is still the fight running underneath Polish politics today. Was Poland's approach a genuinely different model, or just a country that never got tested the way Germany and France were? What do you think? Drop your take in the comments, and if this kind of story is your thing, subscribe for the next one.